For those of you who don't recognize me, my name is Libby Daly. I'm the Associate Director of Membership for Mystic Seaport Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first program in our 2021 Virtual Adventure Series. Tonight's program is featuring Alexander Bolazel's presentation, Sealers and the First Archaeological Expedition to South Georgia. So the Adventure Series began in 1946, and for over 70 years, Mystic Seaport Museum has continued with our tradition of connecting audiences with inspiring stories of personal perseverance and journeys of discovery, growth, tragedy, and triumph. And now more than ever, it is my pleasure to be your guide as we travel with our speakers on these remarkable adventures. But before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to thank my colleagues who are assisting with our program tonight. A special thank you to Dan Harbison, who is in the studio tonight and producing the technical portion of our program. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Rebecca Shea, who'll be assisting me with monitoring the questions in the email. So this being a virtual presentation, you can enter your questions for us, for Alexander when we begin, in the chat feature. For those of you who are new to Zoom, what you can do is you can hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen in the middle and click on the chat icon, and you can type in your questions there. You can also email us at membership@mysticseaport.org. And between Rebecca and I, we will both be monitoring both those formats, and we'll be able to present those questions to Alexander at the end of his presentation. So now I'd like to turn the virtual mic over to our Director of Membership and Partnerships, Margaret Milnes, who'd like to say a few welcoming words.
Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Milnes, and I'm the Director of Membership and Partnerships here at Mystic Seaport Museum, where I have the great privilege of working with Libby and Rebecca and team every day. So thank you so much for joining us this evening as we launch the Virtual Adventure Series 2021. The Adventure Series was one of the very first events we hosted virtually last year, and it is hard to believe we are still in the land of Zoom a year later. Know that we can't wait to see all of you in person just as soon as we safely can. In the meantime, your generous support allows us to create and moderate compelling programs such as these. So please consider giving an additional donation to help us expand and improve our programming where we can. And further to that end, please take a moment to fill out the survey you'll receive tomorrow. We're really eager to hear your feedback and ideas. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Margaret. I'd also like to take this moment to thank our exclusive community sponsor, Stone Ridge Senior Living Life Plan Community. Our friends at Stone Ridge continue to support this engaging program, and we couldn't do this without them. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Jamie Cornell, who is from Stone Ridge, who would like to say a few words.
Hello and good evening. My name is Jamie Cornell, and I am the Marketing and Sales Director over at Stone Ridge. And we are honored and thrilled to be partnered with the Mystic Seaport Museum in the Adventure Series. We have been partners for many years, and it is a wonderful contribution to our community as the Mystic community, but also to our residents. We have many residents that volunteer, some that work at the Seaport, and so it is a wonderful partnership. For those of you who don't know, Stone Ridge is on Jerry Brown Road in Mystic, and we have been in Mystic since 2004 is when we opened. And we are, as Libby said, a life plan community. So that means that we have independent living apartments, assisted living apartments. We also offer an assistance in living program where assisted living services are brought to our residents in their apartment homes. We also have a secured memory care and a 5-star Medicare rated healthcare center called Avalon, where we do short-term and long-term care, and everything's under one roof. So we are always thrilled and honored to be a part of being able to introduce ourselves to all of you. And we'd love to speak to any of you if you had questions about the community or wanted to visit us. So we hope and wish you all to stay well during this time.
Thank you, Jamie. Now it's time for our adventure to begin. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Alexander Bulazel. He's a historian, teacher, archaeological assistant, and Mystic Seaport Museum trustee board member. He's traveled to the ends of the earth. In his travels, he has transited the Northwest Passage 3 times, and most recently, he has been a part of 2 expeditions to Antarctica. In 2019, he participated in the first archaeological survey of South Georgia with the Cambridge Archaeological Unit. And last January, he co-organized America's bicentennial Palmer Expedition. This retraced Captain Nathaniel Palmer's points of exploration on the Antarctic Peninsula. Tonight, he will share his personal observations uncovering sealing activities along the South Georgia coastline, as well as a selection of stunning images from his expeditions to this remote part of the world. Thank you so much, Alexander, for being here tonight and sharing your experiences in photography with us. The virtual mic is all yours.
Thank you very much, Libby. Thank you for that introduction. Well, let's get started. The unknown southern land. Well, it wasn't known until 201 years ago. To think that there was a whole continent on the world here that humanity did not know about. In the year 1820, 3 nations coincidentally converged on the continent, and its knowledge, the knowledge of it was known. We have discovery. In the year 1 millennium ago, I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of technical difficulty, that's why I'm pausing here. Here we go, all right. A millennium ago, the Vikings set out on their first journeys across the Atlantic. Leif Erikson, leaving Greenland, crossed what we believe is the Atlantic and to discover the northern tip of North America. A map such as this, which is the Vinland map, which is part of the Beinecke Library and was on display in Mystic Seaport, which has now been authenticated not to be original, still gives us a good idea of what the world looked and was known to be like at that time. You can see Europe, you can see Greenland, and you can see what is the tip of North America off to the left. Then we come to the fateful year in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And the world that Columbus knew was the Mediterranean and the coast of Europe. And he set off across the Atlantic, as we know and we've learned in our school days, to a world that he thought possibly his crew members thought were flat. The ancient Greeks had calculated the circumference of the earth, but that knowledge had been lost by the time Columbus's era arose. And when he set off, this was the thought of what the world was like. If you look at where it says St. Brandon there, right off to the left, that's what Japan is thought to have been or was. The whole Atlantic is missing. Essentially, the world did not have a North or South America to it. If you correct for this, you can see the North American continent and South America, and what is Cipangu is Japan. Well, multiple voyages of Columbus over his whole lifetime, he still never realized he was on a new continent. He thought he was in the Indies, and that's why we call it the West Indies. Now the next date, 1689, I picked this because a current map that we have, which really describes the planet Earth as known in that time, shows both sides of the globe, the northern hemisphere, the northern pole and the south pole. As you can see, Africa, Asia, even parts of Australia are understood. North America is understood. The Northwest Territories, not so much. The Bering Straits, the Arctic regions are. But if you look at the bottom of the planet, there's nothing there. There is no continent. You can see the very tip of South America, but it's just a blank. In 1773, James Cook sent on a secret mission, which was his second voyage. He had made three exploratory voyages around the world, to which his second one is the one we're going to concentrate on here. discovered an icy mass at the base of the planet, which he surmised was probably a continent somewhere buried in there. But he never actually saw the land. And when you look at this map, you can see the lower points where Antarctica is, where his voyage dipped down. Obviously, the continent was not known, but his secret mission by the Admiralty was to see if such a continent exists, and his report back was there was nothing there of consequence. If there was, it was impenetrable. Now, when you look at South America, you should see there's a South Georgia there between South America and Africa, one of the more remote islands in the world. I'll be speaking about that in the second half of the lecture. He did go to South Georgia and did discover that. Now, the line is incorrect there on the map, but it gives you an idea of all of his various voyages. When he did cross the Antarctic Circle, as I said, there was only ice that he saw. The thought that there was a continent there was two aspects of that were the fact that the icebergs that he saw, which were, as depicted here, fresh water. You only have icebergs like that when they come off of glaciers, and glaciers only exist on land. So obviously he knew that if there were glaciers floating there, they must be coming off of land, but he could not see the land. He also saw that there was rocks and dirt embedded in some of the icebergs, which also indicated that probably there was a landmass there, but of no consequence and nowhere to land. If you look at this old etching, you can see that somebody is hunting there, firing a gun, probably firing there at an albatross that's flying near the ship. And you can see the curious fellow with a pickaxe, and one wonders, why is he using a pickaxe on the ice? Well, if this is fresh water, you can harvest the ice. You can see the boat behind the fellow with the pickaxe. There's a chunk of ice on board. They're harvesting this for fresh water that they can drink, which was a valuable resource in the days of sailing then, and it is still now. After Captain Cook had his various voyages, and regrettably he died on his third voyage in Hawaii, the information that he had gleaned from those voyages was compiled, and this is the world as it was known in Cook's time, or just after his death. And once again, if you look at the base of the planet, it says Southern Icy Ocean. There's no landmass there whatsoever. But if you look at the tip of South America off to the left, you can see there's two small dots there. One would be South Georgia all the way to the right, and the one in between would be the Falkland Islands. By 1820, which is the magical year for Antarctica, three nations converged, all coincidentally, on that continent. They did not really know it was a continent at the time, but they had circumnavigated, at least two of them, and I'll get into that in a second. Two of them had circumnavigated the ice mass, and one of them, our local hero, Nathaniel Brown Palmer, from Stonington, Connecticut, was a sealer, a merchant, and a ship designer. As a young boy, he was in Stonington, and the War of 1812 broke out. Hardy, who was Lord Nelson's second, was bombarding the borough, and you can see a cannonball from that time. Well, 2 weeks later, the British would burn down the White House, but the Stoningtonians defended themselves valiantly. And when Hardy was bombarding the district from Long Island Sound, you can see this is the peninsula at the end of the borough, and off to the right is Fisher's Island. Off to the left, you'll see what is Watch Hill, Rhode Island, and in the middle there is a breakwater which at that time did not exist. But this would have been the world of Palmer, and where he would have left for his voyage in 1820 to Antarctica on board the Hero. Amazingly, a 47-foot-long vessel that he took 5 crew members with, teenagers, himself only 21 years old, and an African-American in his 30s. And these individuals sailed from Stonington down to the Falklands, and later on this scout vessel, which was part of the Stonington sealing fleet, would end up discovering or naming what is now called the Palmer Peninsula in Antarctica. Here's a small display that we had at the seaport, and note the box there in the foreground. I'll get back to that a little bit later on. A model of the hero and an older picture of Palmer. As I said, he was 21 years old when he went down there. This was later in life. The other individual who helped discover Antarctica was Fabian von Bellinghausen, a Russian sent by the Tsar. His scientific mission was similar to Cook's, and the Tsar had sent him to fill in the gaps that Cook had not found. And he also went to South Georgia. And here's an interesting image of the Vostok and the Mirny, which were his two ships, much larger than Palmer's. And this is in a subantarctic island. I find this an interesting image because the penguins and the elephant seals are depicted correctly. A lot of times you will see sort of fantastic animals that are, the artist is only told how they looked, and they don't end up looking the way the actual animal did. So in 1820, the age of Antarctic discovery, before that time, the continent was not known. Three individuals, Nathaniel Palmer from America, Edward Bransfield and William Smith from Britain, and Fabian von Bellinghausen, all descended on the continent. Palmer was sent, or went, because he was a merchant and wanted to find sealing grounds, and it was capitalism and commerce that drove him. Edward Bransfield and William Smith were basically ordered by the British Admiralty to go investigate to see if such a land existed, when there was rumor that somebody had seen land like that, and Edward Bransfield hired William Smith to take his vessel and to go do some investigations. And as I said, von Bellinghausen was sent by the Tsar to fill in what Cook was not able to find and add to Russia's knowledge. So three different individuals congregating at the bottom of the world, all for three different reasons: one for commerce, one for their government, and one for scientific reasons. This was a map put together slightly after their convergence down there. And if you look at the tip of South America, you'll see Palmer Land, and then you'll also see Kaiser, Peter's Island, and Alexander I. This is a German map, and they use the term Kaiser, but that's Peter's Island and Alexander, named by Bellinghausen, and then Palmer Land, which is the peninsula. Now you see there's no continent there, there's just what looked like islands, because at the time only what was known was the peninsula. And above them you'll see Smith, Livingston, Greenwich Islands, and those are the South Shetlands. Those were known, and that was the launching point for discovery of the continent. You'll also see up to the upper right-hand corner, Sud Georgia, that's South Georgia. So this is how we know the Antarctic continent today, and you'll see the peninsula sticks off to the left, and you'll see a slight little wisp of white islands along there. Those are the South Shetlands, and the slight white dot at the very top on up the upper left-hand corner is the South Orkney Islands. The rest of the continent was not known at that time. Mystic Seaport 6 years ago, when I was going down to Antarctica, put together the concept of let's have a bicentennial cruise to commemorate Palmer's voyages. Twice, 2 years in a row, he went down to Antarctica, 1820, 1821. And let's visit the same spots. Some of them are not that easy to visit. 5 years in the works, and in last January, we left and retraced Palmer's route in reverse. We left the tip of South America and raced down to what you'll see is Marguerite Bay at the base of this map. That's also the home of Stonington Island, named after our Stonington here in Connecticut. And we worked our way backwards up. And the reason we did that was we did not know if we could get into Marguerite Bay. It's so far south, vessels normally do not go there unless they're scientific research vessels. And we wanted to make sure we could get down there, clear any ice, and then work our way back up the peninsula. So I'll be giving you this presentation in somewhat reverse. But first you have to clear the Drake Passage. And that's actually a relatively calm picture of it. But once we arrived in Marguerite Bay, and most of Antarctica is like this. It's relatively calm. It's not that stormy. I'm often asked, well, when you go down there in the winter, isn't it bitterly cold? It's actually nicer and warmer than it would be here in New England, usually. We made our way through Marguerite Bay towards Stonington Island, and this will give you a sense of what it's like to do a landing. Stonington Island is about 50 acres. There's two bases on it, interestingly enough, a British one, which is East Station, and there's a American base right over the ridge that is East Base. And this is the British base. Both of these were built just around the beginning of World War II, abandoned because of the war and then re-inhabited again. And this will give you a sense of what it's like to land. Now, once up at the base, you look out, and there's Marguerite Bay glaciers, other islands. You have this beautiful vista. Looking back at the base, Station E, which is the British Bass base on the island, has two buildings, if you notice, and this is quite common with polar bases. In case you have a fire and your base burns down, you need to have a backup. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, so generally you'll always find at least two structures. If there's only one, you're going to find a second structure generally, which would have backup provisions, stores, extra things. In this base, they also had their generator there. The entrance to the base. This was abandoned in the mid-70s. Fire is always a big concern on bases. Not much of a way to put it out, and if everything burns down, there's really no rescue if it's the middle of the winter. Provisions are still there, left over from the past. Food still on the shelf. Dried milk. I'm not familiar with Branston pickle. If you're English, you probably are. There's a spam-like product there. What's unique is seeing this in Antarctica. You can't see this really in the Arctic, because if it was there, polar bears, other four-legged land mammals would have long ago invaded these stores, broken in, cracked open the cans, broken them. I've seen many times where there's tooth marks in the Arctic in canned goods or other canned products. In this case, you look at this, you'll see 1960 on the lower right-hand corner. So that's been there for 60 years, sitting there. And so it's a real time capsule when you visit these bases. Now, going over the ridge, you see East Base, which is the United States Antarctic Service station. A beautiful picture of that with the glacier in the background. Glacier, it'll calve quite often, sending waves across the bay. They had more than two buildings, multiple buildings. I believe there were 4 there. Now, on bases, one of the main concerns is how do you stay warm in your energy source? Well, here they were using coal, and you can see a coal depot off to the right. And the bags that have held the coal has long since rotted away, leaving just the coal there. In the foreground, you'll see some half-tracks that were used, converted vehicles. Antarctica is a non-military zone. At that time, it hadn't been deemed so, but that wasn't until the 1950s. But here you have some half-track vehicles that have been abandoned. Interestingly enough, one of them used a rotary plane engine, and there was a crate there that had a backup engine that's technically in mint condition, though I'm sure it's been weathered with the salt elements there, but it's still original engine. It's a Curtiss Wright engine, rotary. Jackie Ronnie and Finn Ronnie were a married couple. This is not Finn Ronnie. This is a fellow base colleague in the U.S. base. But Jackie Roney has the distinction of being one of the first 2 women ever to overwinter in Antarctica. When the war broke out, the U.S. base was abandoned, but after the war, the Ronnies, or Finn Roney, her husband, had decided it would be a good idea to go back. They knew the stores were there, all the provisions, and they went back to the base and began their scientific work again. Notice the shelf behind them. Same shelf is there now with the various leftover artifacts. Stores and goods are still off to the right side of the base or the building, buried under the snow, unabused by any animals because there are no terrestrial and animals in Antarctica. Clothing dating from that period. And another artifact I came across, our own Steve White. And I know, Steve, if you're listening, it's not fair. I'm an artifact too, but this is a great thing that you supported 5 years before the anniversary to sponsor and help put this trip together. And we enjoyed having you on the trip. It was a great time. When we were done with Stonington, we made our way up the peninsula, and Abercrombie and Kent, which was the other sponsor of this trip, and their vessel, the Pennant vessel, the L'Irial, one of our expedition organizers thought it would be very good to pull the ship into some fast ice and see what it would be like to be locked in, which is a unique experience that most people don't have. You can see seal tracks off to the right. When I said there were no 4-legged animals, there are seals which do go across the surface of the ice. Various ice flows. And next was off to Palmer Station in Anvers Island. And we were there on January 24th, just about a little over a year ago, hardly. And Anvers Island, when you look at the map, is in the center. If you look where it says Bellinghausen and you look to your right, you'll see Anvers. And that's the location of the United States, one of 3 bases we have in Antarctica. And Palmer Station is perched on that little rock, I'm saying is a little rock outcropping, but it's actually quite large. It's a very large glacier behind it that makes it relatively look small. Another view of Palmer Base. Palmer Station. Using Zodiacs when it's time to go ashore in any of our landings. There are no docks down there. You have to bring the ship in to your harbor, your location, and do remote landings with the Zodiacs that are lowered from above the ship into the water. We load the Zodiacs, and we're off to Palmer Station. You can see a work shed in the foreground, common area which has the base emblem on it in front of the flags, laboratories off to the right, I believe. And there's the proverbial pole you always hear about in the polar regions that point the directions to different places. Notice the silver pipe. Right now it's summertime there, height of the warm season, but normally when it's very cold, liquids in pipes freeze and you have to keep them warm. So you have to usually have pipes inside of pipes. The inner pipe will carry whatever liquid you have, and the outer pipe will be a heating conduit in some manner to keep things from freezing. You can't bury lines, it's all rock there, so everything has to be on the surface and insulated. There's our Stonington, 7,319 miles away, with a worn out silhouette of Nathaniel Palmer on the sign. There's a workstation, work shed, and the various piping that you can see the complexity of it to keep the station running. There's a lot of engineering and work that goes into just to do what we consider the basic necessities of life. Oil. In the modern era, oil is what keeps these bases going, and even in the in the Arctic, you'll see oil depots everywhere, whether it's towns or stations. You can't run electrical lines there. We don't use coal anymore, as we saw over in Stonington in World War II. All of these bases have oil depots there. Nuclear power is not allowed in Antarctica. Entering almost all bases, you always have obviously a mud room. You do not want to track in penguin guano. It's quite dirty and quite messy, so you have a substantial mud room where you put all of your suits outfits, boots. And usually all bases also have memorabilia showing the various teams that occupied the bases and worked there. I think this one shows a team, the closest one to us in the image is 1965. And they're scattered throughout these bases. You see whether they're British bases or American bases. I haven't been in any other bases, other nations, but at least in the American and British bases, I see that. Food is very important. You need to keep your caloric uptake very high in cold environments. There you see fresh apples, oranges. I don't know if we drop those off or not. Normally it's good etiquette when you're visiting a base, if you do, to bring some fresh provisions because they obviously will run low. They're very rarely restocked. What you have to have sometimes has to go for months and months. So it's a welcomed treat to have fresh vegetables. If they didn't come from us, these fruits or vegetables, they came from a ship that maybe had visited earlier. And there you see the calendar. That's sort of prophetic. January, and on the 24th in that calendar, they have marked our visit and the Lilireal coming in with Mystic Seaport and Abercrombie and Kent. This is an administrative hallway, and down the hallway you'd have a base commander's office, and because this is Palmer Station, we have our Palmer memorabilia, signed banknotes in his picture. The large part of the work that goes on at the base is scientific, predominantly scientific, and the scientists were nice enough to show us some of their experiments. These are tanks outside, various holding tanks for marine life, experiments going on, and again, in the middle of the winter, this would be all frozen up with lots, very much different environment you'd see. You wouldn't see the open water there, be frozen solid across. Some marine invertebrates. And after they fed us some nice brownies, which they're famous for showing, and again, this is a special trip. People don't normally visit this all the time, but if you are lucky enough to, they gave us some brownies and sent us off on our way. And you might recognize some of the cast of characters here. We pulled out and we headed up, going north through the Gerlache Strait and Kodak Alley onto Deception Island in the South Shetlands. Now, Deception Island is where Palmer's story really takes significance. Deception Island is a volcano that's been partially submerged. The caldera has been broken in, and you can see it on this map here in the center. It's where the line stops, and you can see the curvature of the volcano. Also, before I switch to the next slide, look at Greenwich Island. That figures prominently in the Palmer story also. Here's a chart of Deception. You can see that's the caldera, or the crater. The rim is broken in, the sea is flooded in, and it's still an active volcano. Very warm, the sand can get extremely hot, boiled krill wash up on the shore, but it was also a nice haunt for the sealers and whalemen who came in because of its warmth and extremely protective harbor, if you could get in safely. As you can see, in that opening, which is called Neptune's Bellows, there's a small harbor off to the right, which is called Whalers Bay. This picture is in reverse. This is us leaving, but if you imagine us going in forward over the track of the ship, this promontory on the right, we would go in there and turn right into Whalers Bay. There happens to be a pinnacle of rock in the middle of the channel, and unless you know that and you read the charts, which aren't that perfect down in Antarctica, it could be a dangerous approach depending on the size of your ship. You arrive in Whalers Bay, and you see this moon-like scape. You can tell it's volcanic. Look at the colors there. There have been numerous eruptions over the decades there. Bases, modern bases, have been buried in ash, and it's an ever-changing landscape. I've been going there now for 20 years, and it's more or less the same. There's been erosion, but no major eruptions there, but they have earthquakes. Another view of the beach, you can see that Whalers Bay off to your right, the edge of the water there. These are whalemen's water boats. The tops of them are closed over. They would store fresh water. You could put snow and ice in there, melt them. They'd be floating out in the bay, and they'd keep your water from freezing, and they'd be a fresh provision for incoming ships. If you look at the ridge in the background, you'll see the notch there, and that's the notch or the window that Palmer walked up and it said, looked out and could see across the Bransfield Strait and see Antarctica. Another picture, you can see the moonlight scape. You can see how there really is no vegetation growing there because of the activity. Things don't get time to establish, and it's also a very different environment than the rest of Antarctica. Very much in flux. Another view, you can see our ship, the Lilial, in Whalers Bay, and you can see that collapsing rim of the caldera. Another view. And to give you a sense of the scale, you can see the red flags there and the people. Here's Jason Hicks, our geologist. Those rocks you see there were heaved out with volcanic eruptions. You can see the strata in the black cliff there of the various layers of sedimentation from various eruptions. And I've heard many scholars had claimed that there was no way that Palmer could have looked out from this location across the Bransfield Strait and see land that he would go the next day to investigate, which was the Antarctic continent, and the Palmer was eventually named the Palmer Peninsula. Well, I can tell you, here's a picture that I've took about 20 years ago from that location, and you can clearly see the land. That's not clouds. It's depending on atmospheric conditions. You can see it, sometimes you can't. I've had scholars tell me that it's impossible, you can't see it. Well, I've asked them, have you been there? They said no. Now, I'm sorry, this iteration of the slide got morphed on the system that we have here. It's different on my laptop, but you can still read it. We made history, modern history at least, by bringing back Palmer's box to Antarctica after 200 years of being away. In Whalers Bay, Palmer sailed the Hero, his 47-foot vessel, and was on board this box. This is a small ditty box. It's inscribed L.B. Stonington Sloop Hero. And there's our Glenn Gordonier from Munson Institute and Williams Mystic Program, Steve White, and myself. You can see the inside of the box is with velvet. It's original. Some say it's red flannels. And you can see the notch where Palmer would have walked up and 200 years ago and spied the peninsula. A close-up of the box. L.B. Stonington, 1820 sloop SLP, sloop Hero. I've wondered, I've looked at that a lot, and it's actually five different carving techniques. And given that there was a crew of 5, I'm curious if each one of them took their hand at carving out part of the message in the box. But because of Palmer, Bellinghausen, and Bransfield, we now know of the Antarctic continent. But they only knew of the peninsula, which you can see there is named Palmer Peninsula. But later on, over the next 200 years, the rest of the continent would be fleshed out. Next, it was off to Yankee Harbor. This is on Greenwich Island, and you can see a small ship there, relatively small compared to our boat, a sailboat, and it's a large spit of land off of a mountain. Doesn't look like much in this photograph, and it is located in Greenwich Island, right below the word South Shetlands. Here's a blow-up. This is a map put together by George Powell, who was a sealer, English, who cooperated with Palmer in putting together some maps of the South Orkneys, which they co-discovered. This 1822 map shows Greenwich Island, and you'll see where it says Hospital Cove and a small anchor. That's also known as Yankee Harbor. And this is where a lot of the New England sealers would come. They'd cross across from the Falklands or down from the tip of South America, and coming into the South Shetlands, it'd be your first refuge in a wonderful harbor. It might be a good harbor, but it's a rather desolate place, as you can see. That's a view looking inland. Here's a view looking out. You can see the Zodiac, and right at the bow of the Zodiac, way off in the distance, is our ship. You can get an idea of the distances here. But it's a rather large harbor, well protected, on this spit of desolate rock. Rocks, I should say. So why were the sealers coming down here? Well, obviously for seals. And this was their their goal, fur seals originally. Many of the fur seals have been depleted in South America and the Falkland Islands and other sub-Antarctic islands, and they were searching for new hunting grounds for their prey. This picture actually happens to be a beach that has hardly any seals on it. Normally it'd be wall-to-wall seals, but when I took the picture, it was the end of the season and there were only yearlings there. You can see their beautiful fur on a young pup. As they grow older, they're not so cute anymore, and they're not so friendly either. I think of them sort of as German shepherds with flippers on them. The other wildlife in Antarctica is very friendly, but they can be quite aggressive. They won't attack you, but they will come up to you and growl, and you have to stand your ground with them. Fur seal skins. This is a May 30th, 1824 listing of a cargo that came in to Stonington of different fur seals for sale, coming obviously from Antarctica. The other prey, when the fur seals are starting to be depleted, and while you're down there, why not take advantage of the other animals that you can, and given that day and age, were elephant seals. Here's a depiction, not quite correct, of what an elephant seal looks like, but you get the idea. And the way they were killed was with a spear, as opposed to the fur seals, which are generally clubbed. Several years ago, a spear tip was found in Antarctica. National Science Foundation gave it to Mystic Seaport, and we have it as part of our collection. I saw this as I trekked quite deep into the headlands of the peninsula, and I found this spear there. I don't think it's from that time, but you never know. Things are preserved there quite well, and you'll see as I continue with the talk other objects we've found. Well, here's your prey, elephant seals. Pretty easy to get, all congregating together. And when you look at them that way, they almost look like sacks of oil to what would be a sealer. Elephant seals, or at least the southern elephant seals, can get to 8,800 pounds, twice the size of what northern elephant seals can grow to. And it's said that you can get probably about 50 gallons out of each large elephant seal of clarified pure oil once they're rendered down and boiled. Here's an image of a bull elephant seal being taken by somebody in South Georgia. This was probably in the 1920s. This picture was taken, or in 1910. I'm not sure exact date on that. And here's how they were stripped of their blubber for rendering into oil. Now that was done in tripods and on board ships or on land. And here's a picture, several pictures, one of similar to what we have in the Charles W. Morgan, 3 tripods on a ship, boiling down the oil of whether it's whales, and if in the case of sealers in Antarctica it would be seals, but it's the same concept. And you'd see there's furnaces underneath. It's often asked, how did they bring all the fuel to render down all the oil? It's a very energy intensive process. Well, once you get a fire going and you melt your first amount of blubber down, you take the spent blubber and you throw it into the fire, and that becomes the fuel for the next round of blubber. So essentially the animal is rendering itself down using the scraps and the rendered blubber as fuel for the next generation of fat that's thrown into the tripods. But what is left in Antarctica? Well, in Antarctica proper, in the South Shetlands, this is the only tripod I have ever seen, and this is in Yankee Harbor. This lone tripod sitting on the beach. There were others there. It's believed they floated out or underwater off the shore, under that ice, or probably by the Zodiac. But you can see where the images are of the people in red. There's the tripod. And most people would walk over this collection of rock thinking, well, it's just a collection of random rock, or possibly it was a hut or something like that. Well, this is actually the try-works for the tripod. And how do you know that? If you look at in the foreground, you'll see a maroon-shaped rock. There's maroon-colored rock with 3 rocks there. And there's something that looks like asphalt there. And that's basically what it is, an old version of asphalt or pavement. When the blubber was rendered down underneath the tripod, it was mixing with the sand and the gravel, and it keeps condensing, and it made what is the equivalent of asphalt, gluing together the rocks. And this is one of the telltale signs you can tell if there was a try-works or a furnace in Antarctica in that location, whether it's there or South Georgia. Here's an oil-stained rock. These things are really not noticeable unless you're looking for them. So after we visited Yankee Harbor, it was time to go home, leave Antarctica, and go back to Ushuaia to only learn of the outbreak of COVID. We were the last ship, I think I said, to visit Palmer Station, and we were very fortunate to be able to come home, and just within weeks after that, people were trapped on ships all over the globe. Well, back a year before this, now almost 2 years ago, I was fortunate enough to be part of an archaeological expedition to South Georgia. And this was put together by the Cambridge Archaeological Unit, South Georgia Heritage Trust, and myself representing Mystic Seaport and the American Sealers Perspective on sealers in the region. In South Georgia, it was Americans and British predominantly sealing there, and while the aims were the same, to retrieve furs or oil, American sealing traditions are slightly different than British ones, and we have slightly different ways of doing things. And so, tagging along as a unofficial historian on the trip, I was able to add our American perspective to the sealing, which actually came in quite valuable a little bit later on. You can see South Georgia here as the white little sliver of an island in the middle of the picture. Falkland Islands is the green island off to the left, tip of South America, and the Palmer Peninsula in the red is where Stonington Island is on the Palmer Peninsula. But South Georgia is one of the most remote islands in the world. James Cook is credited with discovering it, though Antonio de la Roche, 100 years earlier, also British, though he does not have a British name, was blown off course and is also said to have landed on an island that he described, which many think it was South Georgia. But Cook formally landed in what is Possession Bay, is where the red circle is, and claimed it for Britain, and it's been a British possession ever since. A lot of people don't realize that during the Falkland Island War, when Argentina invaded the Falklands, they also invaded South Georgia, considering it part of their territory too. If you look at the little blue dot, that is Elsa Hole, and that's where I'll be talking about the archaeological work that we did there on early sealers. An aerial view of South Georgia. And here's the different locations we actually visited. It'd be too long. I'd be here till the wee hours of the morning, go over all of them. But Elsa Hole, you can see right next to Bird Island in the upper left-hand corner, is really the main spot I'll be talking about. After Captain Cook discovered the island in 1775, within 9 years, was it 9 years? Within 9 years, sealing actually began, commercial sealing. The first British sealers arrived at the island, and the industry started. Now, our ship going down there, we traveled 2,000 miles round trip, a little more than that actually, leaving the Falkland Islands on the Hans Hansen, 76 feet, not much bigger than Palmer's vessel. And I had been used to, over the last 10 years, 20 years, traveling on much bigger vessels, such as the most recent trip, the year that I had just spoke to you about, on the L'Illyrial, which is 466 feet long. So there's quite a difference. So arriving in Stanley Harbor, I was thinking, oh, well, the large red ship might be ours. Well, no, it was the smaller blue one that we had to travel almost 900 miles to South Georgia on. Took about 5 days. The inside of the vessel, watertight doors. She was originally built in the 50s as a life-saving vessel, I believe Swedish, Scandinavian, and was retasked and bought by new owners and brought down to Antarctica. And there have been 2 owners of her in the Antarctic region. And this is one of them, co-owners of the vessel, Laura. And this was our one communal area on board the ship. the bridge. And when I look at our own Charles W. Morgan, a little over 100 feet, I would have probably much rather been on board her, a much smoother ride than we would have experienced in the Hans Hansen. Probably the Hans Hansen is much safer, but the ride was not that nice, crossing for 5 days over and then going against the weather coming back. Elsa Hole is where we first landed. You can see the green promontory there. We rounded the corner into the harbor, that headland, right above the foldable crane that takes our Zodiacs out. Put the Zodiacs in the water and went ashore. And when you land in Antarctica, this is normally what greets you. Two things to note in that video. One was that the seals were small pups and yearlings. Normally, any other time of year, we purposely went there when that's what was inhabiting the beach, because if you went there during the full season, you couldn't even walk on that beach. It'd be full of fur seals and quite aggressive ones. So those were rather friendly. Also, the sounds you hear, that was rather quiet. Normally, we'd hear that sort of primal sound all day long, 24 hours a day, which was, I thought, rather nice. Other people thought at times could be a bit creepy, but I thought it was nice. We landed, and the first thing we did was start creating a grid. Here, Chip is pulling the line, and we've created a grid pattern on the area that we're going to start our dig at. Another picture. Right now, that area looks like just a pile of rocks. And it always did to me in the past when I used to go by it as a tourist in the bay. You could see these tripods, but that was it. You saw those tripods, and other than their existence there, not much was known about them, other than this was a mecca for sealers, as a safe harbor and where they conducted their business. But were these tripods originally in this location? Were they just put there temporarily? No one knew the answers to these questions. Now, that's very similar, if you look at that, to what the Morgan has. But there's no brickworks around it. You can see two tripods we have. You can see the what essentially is the chimneys, or where the smoke exits the furnace below. The brickworks around it, you see a metal strapping holding the brickworks together. Another view. The copper sheathing over it is allowed, any blubber that's thrown onto that copper can be just pushed into the cauldrons and melted down, and then the oil can be ladled out. And here's a depiction of blubber being cut, whether it's whale blubber or seal blubber. It's the same concept, to be put into the cauldron or the tripod, melted down, and whatever leftover residue is thrown underneath the tripod and continues to feed the fire and boil more blubber down. So the question was this actually a tri-works or not? So when you first look at it, you can see a few stones around it. Is that just happenstance, or was that actually the makings of a tri-works, a firebox for them? Now, this is a very interesting picture. If you look at the three tripods and you look at the seam on the middle as reference on the middle one, and you can see the Hans Hansen out in the harbor. This picture was taken a little less than 2 years ago. Now, here's the same picture, same angle, taken in 1975. You can see the tripods are completely buried in dirt, tussock grass all about, and ironically there are elephant seals right next to the same pots that 100 years or 150 years earlier would have rendered them down. But the question is, why is all of that earth gone and all of the vegetation gone? And I'll get to that in a little bit at the end of the talk. But now that we had a bare and clean beach, which is actually, though it's clean and it's good for archaeological purposes, actually one of the more less unattractive beaches. There are beautiful beaches there in Antarctica and South Georgia. This one, because of all of the erosion, was extremely muddy and dirty. We'd go around and we'd look on the stony beach for different artifacts. You can see this is what's thought to be an anchor or some sort of a weight that a rope would be put through the eyelet where my hand is touching. A piece of wood projecting out, some sort of a piling. Remember, there are no trees down there, so any wood you see has been brought in by man, and if it's like this especially, it's not even washed up on shore. It's been purposefully placed there for some reason. And you also see a fastening down there being measured. All of our equipment had to come back and forth from the Hans Hansen every single day, and it had to be cleaned every single day when we brought it aboard, and then disinfected when we went from location to location, because we didn't want to bring any pathogens from one area to the other. You don't want to infect one colony of penguins with a disease that another one might possibly have. So there's very strict protocols you have to follow. The archaeology work there is a little different than anywhere else in the world. The various tools we had, the gear we had to bring back and forth. You can see a metal detector in the lower right-hand corner we had to use, though it wasn't that helpful for us, because there wasn't that much metal there other than the obvious ones. Trowels, brushes, and then the fun work began. We got to excavate underneath the tripods for the first time. No one had done this. I was tasked as a digger by the three archaeologists, Dr. Marcus Britton, who led up the group from Cambridge Archaeological Unit. I was his grunt digger, and he taught me the protocols the day before. He said, "All right, begin digging, Alex." And so I put the trowel in, I started digging, and a little bit through it, I looked up at him, I said, "I'm the first person to actually ever dig in South Georgia or on the island." He goes, "That's very true. You have that title now." The first thing we discovered was these tripods had legs, but curiously, what are they resting on? As you can see, they're not resting on anything. They're suspended on top of sand. So there must have been something holding them up. Was it the metal bars that we saw there? We didn't know. Was it a rock superstructure around it? We didn't know. But the pots were floating on sand, which they couldn't have done, because as we went further down, you can see where the cracklings or the blubber that had been used to fire the fires under them was on a distinctly different strata. If you look at this picture here, right by the foot, you can see where it's sand, and then you can see the black where it was the ashes or the cracklings from the blubber. Obviously, something was holding these up. Everything was measured, recorded, and if you look to the left, you can see some bricks. Those are yellow bricks, and that started to answer a lot of questions, very similar to what we've seen in the Charles W. Morgan. Some more cracklings. This is once I was able to break through. It was interesting. Some layers are extremely hard, some were rather soft. This was all bundled up, put into a bucket, and that's now at Cambridge being analyzed for what the contents are. As we continue to dig, you could see now that the firebox or furnace was starting to show itself. Notice the metal strap there. That's similar to what you saw in the Morgan's previous picture, a strap that was used probably to hold brickworks together. And it became more and more evident there must have been a significant brickwork here holding up all of these three tripods like on the Morgan. Where did it go? Well, as we dug, these bricks began to crumble. They were like very soft styrofoam. They were not very solid. If you just kneeled on them, they would crumble away into dust. And as they dried out over a period of 3 days, they were crumbling away. We took some samples that are now also in Cambridge, yellow brick and you see red brick. Yellow brick is usually used for the interior firebox, red brick for the outside. Some people say, well, bringing bricks down there, wasn't that quite an extravagance? Well, no, you need ballast in your ship anyway. So if you're going to bring bricks down, that's fine. Bring them in the ballast of your ship. You can build a tri-works, you can fill it up with rock and sail home, but generally, if you were successful, you'd fill it up with oil or sealskins, which would act as ballast anyway. One of the most significant discoveries was this small little brick with this dimple in it. And as you can see, it was right off of the corner of the firebox. That meant that this was a pivot point for what must have been an iron door for each side of the box, and that only that pivot point was in existence at this point. So we were hoping that possibly we would find an iron door. Was it still there or not? After each layer was removed, Dr. Britton would say, yes, move on to this part, that part, and we'd do more investigations. We had to time out our trip because we only had a month there on the island, and we had a lot of places to go and investigate, so we couldn't get caught up in one spot. But he said this was worth continuing the investigation on. We were hoping to find doors like this in the Morgan. Now, these doors slide back and forth on a metal rod. The ones down here in South Georgia at Elsa Hole were probably, or we know, were now on a hinge system. And lo and behold, we started digging and we found a piece of metal. The square one there, or what looks triangular now, became a square. And what was revealed at first was, if you look very carefully, you can see what's burlap there. Later on, several weeks later in the expedition, at another location, we discovered a spear point that had been covered in burlap and greased. And we assumed that the sealers had done that to keep their metal objects safe when they would return back to the north. They knew they were coming back the following season, and they could have a object that hadn't rusted away in the sea, in the air, in the corrosive environment. That's only supposition, but that's what we were thinking. Well, we found the same situation. At the time, we thought there was just a rag that had been lost and ended up next to the iron door. You can see the yellow coloration. That's the iron door, the oxides coming out of it. Here's another close-up of the burlap. Regrettably, that literally turned to dust and does not exist anywhere, whether it's in Cambridge or there. That's gone for good, but at least it was recorded in the few photographs I took. Once that was removed, you can see the end of the pintle that fit into the brick, and you can see the outline of the door. And now the door is starting to emerge. You can see where the two pintles are, and now you can imagine it as a hinged door on that firebox. Another image of the door. Below it, you'll see that there's more cracklings. They must have shoveled out all of the ashes, which makes sense, to the side of the furnaces and kept stoking it with more blubber. Now, working there was very difficult. As I said, the bricks would come apart if you just touched them. They weren't that strong, and you had to crouch there and trying to dig through there without hitting anything and disturbing it for 3 days. I ended up with rather sore knees. Another image of the bricks. And what the environment is like working there. Once we uncovered what we decided to uncover, we could have kept going and going. Everything was recorded, measured, painstakingly measured. This was not necessarily the fun part of the digging, excavation work. Walls were recorded that we found. Each rock was recorded to excruciating detail, measured out. Grids were laid down. And now you can get a sense of there must have been a structure there. Those stones are not haphazard, but there must have been a stone building there surrounding a brick try-works. And oft you can see where the that red and white pole is for giving scale. We found the other door to the furnace. Details of that had to be drawn because we did not take that back with us. That was reburied at the site, and it was mandated by the South Georgia that we had to restore things back the way they were unless we took an artifact with us that would go to the South Georgia Heritage Trust and on to England for further study, but ultimately returned back to South Georgia, or at least to the possession of the government of South Georgia. So once again, we're back to the try-works. You can see the furnace below the try-pots. Before we were to close up the excavation, Marcus said, let's see how far down we go and what's there. And surprisingly, I hit a substance that was harder than concrete. I've been around the building industries my whole life. This was harder than concrete. I had to borrow the ship's mechanic's masonry tool that he used to hit rust off the vessel. And I had to chisel through what was extremely hard. Just to create that one bucket was more than 2 hours worth of work. At that point, we had collected enough of the sample up. We're pretty sure that it was the cracklings in just the ultra hard equivalent of asphalt, conglomeration of sand and rock down there with years or decades of seal oil melting down into it. But it was amazing how hard it was. To me, one of the most fascinating parts of this whole month-long trip, and this might sound odd, is when you break through that, you could smell as if the fire had occurred yesterday, even though it could have been 150 years ago or 200 years ago. When you read Moby Dick, you hear about the belching black smoke of whalers, and the filth and the dirt and the smell. Well, this was like smelling history. It was like a greasy fire, but I was thinking nobody's really smelled that. It was quite an interesting thing to unearth. Looking out towards the bay, there was a pot or a tripod that we sort of ignored, figured it was a fragment. You can see it here. And we figured, well, we'll just see what that goes to. Why was there a fourth pot or tripod there? Andrew began excavating that, digging it out, and we just thought it would be a random fragment. We flipped it over, and lo and behold, it had a stub. If you look at the upper part of the curvature of the top of the pot, a stub there, no legs. This meant it must have been on a tripod and could be tilted to pour out probably purified oil. So essentially what we had here now was a factory situation. It's hypothesized that the blubber was boiled down in the 3 tripods and moved then for further rendering in this tripod. You can see the peg that was made the pot tiltable. And this has not been seen, or at least that I know of, on South Georgia or anywhere there. So this was actually ended up being quite a big discovery. Off in the distance, you can see Dr. Britton and Chip working. There was a wooden structure found. We couldn't excavate all of that, but the goal was to see roughly what the parameters of that building was. And the meaning of that was that this was a rather large structure, over 30 feet long, 15 feet wide, and this was not some temporary thing that normally it was thought that the sealers were transient. They'd be dropped off, they'd do their sealing, and they'd come back. This was a permanent structure there. Suspended, if you see by these, there's along that straight board is 2 small pilings. There are several of them there, so the structure is actually suspended off of the beach, held up with a dry floor, and we saw this in other locations to keep the sealers dry. And it was a rather big building. You can see those small pilings, that's all that remain of them. And the discussion revolved around, well, who built this? Was it Americans or English? But we maybe had a way to tell. If it was oak, it might have been British, and if it was pine, it might have been Americans. So samples of the wood were taken, and they're off being investigated in England by a dendrologist. I, being the American, and I think I know my wood pretty well, I'm pretty sure that's pine, but I'll let the experts make the final rendering on that. So the day came to close up the site. That's Dion Ponce next to the 2 of us were the ones who were in charge of excavating this tri-works. Dion has the distinction of being the only living person ever born in South Georgia. He was born aboard his mother and father's yacht in Leith Harbor, and there were some sealers, modern day whalers, and sealers at the turn of the century, some children born there no longer living. Dion is the only living person who can truly call himself a citizen of South Georgia. We blocked up the feet of the tripod since there was nothing actually holding it but the sand. Reburied the excavation, sadly. Reburied the tilting tripod in front of it, said goodbye to our penguins and the seals on the beach, and left our muddy, dirty location. And if you look up on the hills, you can see that the tussock there, you can see the erosion that's beginning there, and I'll show you in a second. Why were we even doing this? What led us to excavate in South Georgia now? Two things did. Excuse me. Bob Burden and seals. Bob Burden is an Englishman who holds a polar medal, was the founder of the South Georgia Museum, has written extensively in both the Arctic and Antarctic. And Bob, having been stationed on South Georgia, realized that the tussock is disappearing because the seals are using it as a habitat, sitting on top of it and crushing it down. And this is creating massive erosion. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. Well, fur seals have not been harvested as a fishery for close to 100 years, and their population is exploding beyond of what it probably naturally was. Their food source is krill, and the krill is also eaten by whales, but the whales have not come back as strong yet. It'll take them longer, so there's an imbalance, it's thought. And the seal population has exploded. And Bob said we need to document these sites before they wash away. If you remember back to the tripod that was completely buried in dirt and tussock in 1975, this is happening all over the island. Here, Ian, Andrew, and Marcus are trudging through some tussock. You can see the size of it. Here we are on the top of a large hill. You can see two small seal heads poking out. But what the seals use it for is a nest. It's much nicer to lie on the tussock than it is on the cold beach. And by using that, they're destroying the plant life. The root systems are gone, and now the mud washes down the hill into the bay and destroys the habitat. Another picture, you can see sort of the mucky hillside. That's all due to seal damage, working their ways up the hills. And if you look at this middle promontory there, you see the small beach below. The tussock is not destroyed there because it's too steep for the seals to go up. And if you look at the promontory there, there's a albatross colony there. Seals can't get there, so the albatross are safe. But on this hillside, where it's a shallow slope, they can come up all the way there, and any habitat that would be for bird life is being destroyed. You can see that's a picture of the fledglings on that outcrop. Here's a picture of Andrew walking up the hillside, and you can see how far the erosion goes up the hill. This was all green tussock 25, 30 years ago. Even in the 20 years that I've been going there, I've seen massive erosion. And here's a final example of a hilltop. You can see the damage that is being done by the fur seals. That's not human damage, that's animal damage. The eroding hillside. And if you look in the water, you can even see it's sort of brackish down by the beach. This is all of the sedimentation coming out, washing into the ocean. Well, it was our time to leave the island, or time to leave at least that excavation and move on to the next location. And so if you're lucky, at the end of a long day, you might come across an iceberg, clear and blue like that, maybe 10,000 years old, over the pressure from the glacier it came from that squeezed out all of the oxygen bubbles, leaving what is like crystal and that beautiful blue color. If you find a small piece, you can haul it up on deck and probably make the most expensive gin and tonic out of the supplies available. No limes, but we had some lemons, and we actually did not drink on board. This was one of the rare times we had any alcohol, but that's quite a unique gin and tonic with a small iceberg floating in it. And after a bunch of those, you might someday imagine that you're back in Antarctica at the end of the earth, looking at a sealer or Nathaniel Palmer himself. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. That was great. We got a lot of questions that have come in. I think I'll start with the first question. What has drawn you to Antarctica since you've been going there for over 20 years, you said? What do you think is the pull that keeps bringing you back there?
Well, I have to credit that to my son. My children are 7 years apart, and my son wanted to go traveling, and my daughter was too young to travel at the time. And I said, where would you like to go? And my wife said, why don't you guys pick a place that would be good for the two of you to go? And he said, well, I want to go to Alaska, and I want to see some polar bears. And I had a horrible vision of being on a Carnival cruise ship in Alaska with thousands of people. And I sort of flippantly said, how about Antarctica instead? You'd see penguins instead of polar bears. He jumped at that, and then I had to start doing my research, and I realized it wasn't as easy as I knew it wasn't easy, but as easy as I thought to get there. And after a year of planning, and our ship happened to hit a horrible storm, the trip was put off a year. We made it the second year. I caught the bug going there. My son likes it, but ever since then, I've caught the bug, and now I basically spend my time going between Antarctica and the Arctic, back and forth to both poles. So I have to credit him with that.
Great. We had a question come in just about the images you were just showing of the tussocks. Do you think without sealing, would there still be that type of erosion, or just like naturally, or do you think just all the sealing that's happened?
As I said, these were plans. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, to quote Robert Burns. The issue is that the seals are now not being controlled. There's no hunting. I'm not necessarily advocating hunting, but there's an imbalance. When there was hunting, at least, there were several successive waves, and it generally went about 30, 40 years in between various waves of hunting. After 3 or 4 years, the seals would be decimated. Then they would come back again. They'd be redecimated, and they'd come back again. And this went on 4 or 5 cycles. But when it was finally stopped, the seal population now is exploding to the millions and millions of them. And they're just taking over the whole habitat. I've noticed this in the 20 years that I've been going there. To their locations you cannot land at anymore. It's not actually safe with the fur seals there. And until there's an equilibrium, and no one knows, I'll leave that to biologists to decide, but one hypothesis is that the krill, which they eat, is very abundant for them. And the whale populations haven't come back because their cycle of reproduction is a lot slower than the seals, and it might take another 100 years to come back. So one theory is if you cull the seals now, you'll stop the erosion, and eventually when the whales come back, you'll get an equilibrium.
Okay. Along the lines of the climate and the area, does it snow pretty much year-round in Antarctica?
No, actually, Antarctica itself is considered a desert. There's very little snow there. It's just that it blows from one side of the continent to the other, and it accumulates and doesn't necessarily melt off. Now, if there's global warming in certain parts of the peninsula and around the periphery, it's melting away. But basically, it's millions of years of accumulation of snow that's turned into ice that's built the glaciers that cover the continent.
A question about the structures that you encountered. How are Antarctic bases made fireproof if they also need to be highly insulated? Do you know that?
I don't know how they're made fireproof. I do know that there's a lot of protocol in keeping fires from starting at these bases, whether it's cleaning machinery, whether it's making sure there's not oil drips, things like that. But again, when you say insulated, the modern bases are rather well insulated. It's modern. You have metals there, non-flammable items. In the older bases, they were built out of wood, and they really didn't have insulation in the walls. They were probably wearing their gear on the inside as well as the outside. But in a modern base, the inside is much like a modern structure here. But you still have to be extremely careful, because if something burns down, you can't call a fireman. You have to be trained in that protocol.
And actually, that leads me to another question that we had in the chat. Are there people who work full-time on the pipes and power sources, or is everyone who's on a mission or at the base trained in a lot of aspects to be able to respond?
Depends on the base, but generally, you need to be a jack of all trades, but there are specific people who are only mechanics there, only scientists. But the scientists are still trained in mechanics, and the mechanics are trained, or at least want to, for diversion, help the scientists. So everybody is sort of a jack of all trades. You have to be a self-sufficient community there. But if somebody's interested, a younger person's interested in going to Antarctica, or even an older person, if you want to volunteer and you have a skill in being a mechanic, or especially being a cook, you can sign up. You don't have to be a scientist to go to Antarctica. I mean, there are opportunities to go there if you want to go there, and that sort of a life is not a deterrent to you.
That's interesting. We had a couple questions about Cook and the history of the discovery of Antarctica. One was, do you think it's possible England was keeping Cook's discovery of Antarctica under wraps, similar to Harrison's timepiece during this period?
Well, Cook did have Harrison, when he went off on his various voyages, the Admiralty tasked him with what was considered the top technology of the time. Whether chronometers he had, and as I said, even his mission to try to discover if there was a continent there was a secret until he opened his orders. The Admiralty obviously kept secrets and did not want things leaking out. But after Cook's death, the maps were published. Cook surmised there was land there. He knew there had to be land, but he never actually saw it. Whereas Palmer and Bellinghausen and Bransfield actually saw land on the Palmer Peninsula.
And a follow-up question to that, how familiar with Cook's mission do you think those three were?
Well, Bellinghausen certainly was, because his job was to infill. In the case of South Georgia, Cook had sailed along the northern edge of it. Actually, he sailed in the wrong direction against the weather, which made his voyage even all the worse. He actually didn't really like the place that much. Whereas Bellinghausen circumnavigated the whole island, and was also on the southern and northern sides of it. So Bellinghausen was very aware of that. I can't speak to what Palmer's knowledge was, and I would assume Bransfield had a knowledge of it being part of the British naval system.
In all your travels coming to and from Antarctica, what impact have you seen from an increase in tourism to the region, if any?
When I first went there, and I wasn't there in the golden age of tourism, and that was 15, 20 years earlier. But still, when I went there, you could really go around once you did a landing, as long as your expedition leader allowed it, you could more or less travel about in that harbor, that bay, that area. But now there's more and more and more restrictions. I mean, tens of thousands of people go there on various ships. And so the landing sites are limited. Where you can go on the landing sites is limited. And that was one of the big draws for me to do this archaeological trip, the first one especially, because we were given a license by the South Georgia government to essentially have free reign, except for some very select sites, to walk around in the hills, to do as we want, to investigate, look for sealer locations, something that no tourist can do. And I understood that, having traveled there, and I knew this was an opportunity that I should seize upon. I'd never have it again, and I don't know if I'll ever have it again in my life, or anybody else will. It was quite a unique permit we received, that we were able to basically traipse about the island in the various designated locations that we had pre-identified. Bob Burden's work had done, along with Marcus's, and dig what we thought was important and take what we wanted for study. Something that when you go there now, you have to stay within flagged boundaries, certain lines. You can't interact the way that we did.
Okay. Let's see. Tourism question. So are you planning on going to a future expedition?
Oh yes, I am. In fact, if it wasn't for COVID, at least for the Arctic, Abercrombie and Kent for the first time is running a expedition now along the eastern route of the Arctic over Siberia. So that would end. I would have essentially now circumnavigated the Arctic, and I'm always game to go to Antarctica. It's now an issue of how much my wife will allow me to do that, because unless she wants to go, because you are gone for 3-4 weeks at a time if you do this. But if Marcus is going to do another expedition, I will be the first to sign up. He calls me his #1 excavator since I've already been trained in those protocols.
Oh, that's great. I think we've touched on all the questions. Some of the questions that came up in the chat, I believe you answered just throughout your program. So I just want to thank you so much again for joining us tonight and being a good sport and us testing out this new medium to share your story with everyone. I hope all of you can join us next week for our next presentation. It's Skip Finley. He's an author and historian, and he'll be sharing the stories of whaling captains of color and their struggle. So thank you all so much, and thank you again, Alexander. It was a great presentation.
You're welcome.
Everyone be safe.
Bye-bye.